Duncan, it really is the end of an era. One of the titans of corporate China leaving. What sort of legacy is he going to leave behind?
Well, you're right. I mean, I think he, as a titan, is not from the States. You know, he is the state-owned enterprise companies dominated initially. There were lots of smaller private sector companies, even from the early 80s. But he's the one who really gave those private sector companies a face and scale because of the internet. So the legacy is really combining those two things, the private sector revolution, which was already underway in places like Zhejiang and Guangdong and all that, but combining that with tech to make these large national and now global companies. And he's the first among equals amongst those.
Yeah, well, you did literally write the book, as we said, The House That Jack Built, and I'm sure you gathered many anecdotes about Jack Ma along the way. I just wondered if you could share one of your favourite ones with us.
Well, actually, I mean, 20 years ago, I actually met him in this small apartment and called the Hupan Garden Apartments, where they founded the company. And walking into that small apartment where there were 19 or 20 people crammed together, you know, everybody's shoes were off at the door. And you could smell. It wasn't the easiest to smell to contemplate, but it was the smell of a startup, you know, with noodles and socks, basically. So the Silicon Valley in China, you know, legend was born really with Alibaba, I think.
So Duncan, what is it about Jack Ma, a former English teacher, that gave him what? The vision, the inner entrepreneur urge to start a company that was, you know, coming out of nowhere almost, coming out of China, building up an industry that had begun, but was still in its early days to a certain extent.
Yeah, like I say, he combines sort of chutzpah with blarney. You know, he's sort of got this amazing communication ability, as we've all seen in English, but of course also in Chinese. So it's language, but it's also his grit, you know, his determination. Alibaba's his third company, actually, that he started. His first one was a translation company that failed. The second one was a tech company that was, squeezed out by the government. So it was his third time around, you know, third time lucky for him. So the determination is a key part of that. He also had worked briefly for the government before, and we know, of course, that he had joined the Communist Party in university, although, you know, many people did at that time. But the question is, as the company gets bigger, is how do they coexist with the government and with state-owned enterprises that they're actually challenging?
Well, I think that's a very important question. And so how did Jack Ma, how has he navigated that so far? Is he in some sense leaving at a time when this might get a little more difficult, at a time when President Xi he's pulled in the reins of power more? Is this a good time for Ma to be leaving the company?
Yes, I mean, I think, you know, he telegraphed his decision to step down. Of course, this is, you know, we should take that with a pinch of salt, which you can buy on Alibaba, by the way. Pinches of salt, but you know, he is stepping down as chairman. He's retaining his board seat and also crucially membership of the Alibaba partnership and also other assets like Ant Financial. So he's not going away completely, but he telegraphed over a year ago his desire to step down as chairman because, you know, the mood has shifted from the government towards private sector companies, what the government in China often calls non-public companies, the non-state-owned companies. You know, the state-owned companies are really in the ascendant again. And also individual tech and other CEOs have been in the firing line for various transgressions or the fact they're doing well, you know. So I think he reads well the music and he's pulling a bit to the side, but he's not stepping down completely.
Yeah, so what does Alibaba look like post Jack Ma? If he's not stepping down completely, there'll always be this long shadow cast from the corner of the room. How's Daniel Zhang going to manage things?
Yeah, well, Daniel, is the third CEO. Jack was the first, and then there was a second, and then Daniel. So, you know, he's been in place for a number of years. He's now becoming also the chairman. To some extent, I think, you know, any founder of a high-profile company like this, particularly a very high-profile individual, is hard to replace. And to some extent, he isn't being replaced by Daniel. It's sort of a self-driving company to some degree now. I mean, Daniel is a skilled administrator, comes from accounting background. You know, to some extent, Jack and the team have built a machine. It's a cash machine, actually, in terms of retail. It's also moving into cloud and into new areas. And actually, those new areas are not really Jack's forte. He's not a technologist. You know, he really comes from that entrepreneurial, salesy kind of background. And now it's up to, you know, the technical guys, frankly, to build on that.
Well, if you really want to wind back the clock even further, he really comes from a teaching background, doesn't he? A former English teacher, and now he's going to return to education, a system which he said needs an overhaul. So what does Jack Ma do next?
Yeah, so China domestically obviously has massive challenges, including in rural areas or more generally in reforming lots of areas, including education. Again, that's, the preserve of the state, so he's going to have to tread carefully. He's also, a very international guy. He's often now in Africa and actually talking about entrepreneurship and in Africa and sort of funding prizes there. He, to some extent, likes the fact that Africa reminds him perhaps of those early days in China that he saw the opportunity. So he's spreading his wings. He's narrowing his focus, though, I think, to education, environment, and philanthropy, areas that, frankly, aren't going to be a challenge to the government under a increasingly authoritarian Xi.
We're showing a shot just now of Jack Ma getting ready to go toe-to-toe with Elon Musk, and that made a lot of news. How did you watch it, and what did you make of that interchange?
Yeah, the Ma and Musk tie-up without a moderator, I think, was an interesting one. Very different individuals. I mean, it was very clear that Jack almost was sort of uncomfortable, I think, in that setting, particularly talking about the negative aspects of AI or the future of technology, because he almost has not a blind faith, but a very solid faith in technology. His own experience has been how much that has changed China, changed his life. Whereas Musk is famously, is much more worried about, the robots taking over and so on. And I think that speaks to, the stuff that Jack really is inspired by. Just a week earlier, he had a women's event in Hangzhou with Rihanna and others flowing. He likes being in the limelight for the softer skills stuff, I think, rather than, pure tech. He doesn't come from a technical background nor a finance background. So he's going to be able to play to his strengths now, I think.